Thank y'all so much for coming today. It is my privilege to introduce Connor Loken in his honors presentation. In my time at VMI, I have yet to know someone who has finished in 3 years while in the honors program, and so Connor's a first, which is a big, big deal. And also, I want to tell just a little story about this project. It was originally planned to be a project of doing advanced analytics for the basketball team. We had actually arranged work with the basketball team. We had set up office space down in their space, and we had the agreement of that, and everything was going to be really cool. I thought it was an amazing opportunity, and lo and behold, guess what happened? I think everyone in this room knows what happened. Our coach left to go someplace I won't talk about, and we had to go somewhere else. And so, like any good advisor, I gave Connor a problem that I had been unable to solve, and told him to go compete with billions of dollars of people in industry and see if he can find something better than that, right? Because that's what you should give an undergraduate, because I'm a good advisor. And so that's what I put before him. He beat his head against the wall for quite a while, and I thought he's finally come up with a really neat answer. So Connor.
Thank you very much, sir. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Connor Loken. You guys have had plenty of time to read that slide, so I'm not going to go ahead and reread it to you. But essentially what I'm going to tell you about today is how to predict basketball and football, specifically NCAA and professional. So first off, why do we care? As Colonel Seniors so kindly said. First off, it's a large and growing field right now. A lot of people are working on this. As Major David was saying, it's $1 billion industry right now. Our original thought with working with a team to help them improve has started, if anyone's seen Moneyball, like that kind of concept is pretty new, but it's quickly exploding. So, second off, it's a huge prediction contest as well. It's like the Mount Everest of prediction challenges. Because no one really knows how can we perfectly predict a sport. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of randomness. This Kaggle competition actually has a 5-figure prize for anyone who can best predict March Madness. And it's also just great for teaching kids how to learn about statistics. I know Stats 405, when I took it with Major David, we did a lot of work with learning the concepts through sports, because sports are the easiest way to try and get together with these concepts that you don't really have a connection to with the students. And it's really hard. As Major David said, it's just a really hard problem, and it took a lot of effort to try and bring all these statistics concepts and bring them to the forefront and use them in sports. And we're just going to gloss over the last little point there. But maybe you could do something with this right here. So, as Thomas Edison said, I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. That was my entire summer. I spent the majority of this summer almost literally banging my head against a keyboard trying to see what would work. Some of the examples for you. Fancy way of saying, I'm going to use first bullet point there is just a fancy way of saying I tried to incorporate past game data into the current games. So like try and quantify injuries or players out and everything. That didn't do too well. I tried making a different model for every single team in NCAA basketball, which was a lot. And that also didn't work out very well. We tried using possessions, we tried all different kinds of statistics, and every single time we kept not reaching. It was all right, but it was never like as good as it could be. Until we finally hit the clustering, which I'm going to get into a little bit more later, because that's really what brought us to where we are right now. Here's a little bit on what I'm going to be talking about. And then, again, what are we trying to do? I'm trying to either come up with some new way or improve an old method. Because why reinvent the wheel? If I've already got something that's working really well, why don't I just take that and try and build on that? Maybe use different statistics, something along those lines, to eventually, we'll see if I can be the best. That's always the goal, right? Try and be the best. So, to start off, I want to talk a little bit about the line, which is Vegas's prediction, for lack of a better word, on the game. The thing to remember, though, is that Vegas is trying to get people to bet. And so they're going to try and put a value and say, like, for example, let's say Duke is playing Carolina, and they want people to bet on this game. So what they're going to say is, I'm going to give it a 0 rating. So essentially, you just have to bet on either side of that and say, oh, Duke's going to win or Carolina's going to win. And depending on how probable they are to get a 50-50 split on either side, they're going to try and increase or decrease that value. So if Duke was the home team, they're going to give it a positive rating and say Duke is favored by 10. So if their output is a 10, that essentially is their prediction. They're predicting Duke to win by 10 points. And if it's a negative 10, vice versa. And what they're trying to do, though, is get 50% of bettors on either side, like I said. So the idea is that it could be slightly biased towards popularity, or we think there might be a possible crowdsourcing that kind of goes on with the line. So we wanted to try and correct that. And we came up with this idea of using Google Trend data. Now, this was a pain, to say the least, and it took me months to just get the data for this. But if you see down here, these are little average bars, and then you see this big peak. The reason why there's this big peak is because Auburn won the NCAA tournament that year for football. And what we were trying to do is compare every other team to Auburn in that season. And what we were then going to do is take these average bars down here and input them as numbers, and then we're going to take a z-score to normalize them and input those into our data to then try and correct the line. That's kind of making sense. The hardest part about this was that Google doesn't give you any raw numbers. It's all relative to the highest peak, which is why we decided to choose whoever won that year, because they're most likely to be Google searched the longest. So instead of getting raw numbers, which would have been a lot easier, we had to deal with these relative values, because the highest peak was always 100. And then, as I said, clustering. So this was where we first really had some success. And the idea behind this, I have a little graph here to show you as well, is that we're going to split up all the teams into 3 different categories here. A tier 1, a tier 2, and a tier 3. And what those are the way we did that is we took the point differential, which is just on average how much more do they score compared to their opponents that they've been playing, and their strength of schedule, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's just how hard are the opponents they face. And we found that it gave this kind of nice look to it. You can see back here. What we were trying to do was we used the k-means, and we had to choose how many clusters we wanted. With every cluster, we were building a model in between them. So tier 1 teams, what happens when tier 1 teams play tier 3 teams? So like Duke versus VMI. Duke should have an inherent advantage. Like that's just, Duke's gonna win. Sorry, VMI. But Duke will win every single time. But why is that? We thought there might be some inherent advantage, because even if the point differential, like I was saying, even if their point differential is similar, Duke's all the way up here. They have this huge strength of schedule. Whereas other teams who might have a similar point differential aren't playing as hard teams. So we were trying to think, maybe we could quantify this. When we were building the models, we were estimating boundaries, which is kind of an issue here. Because we couldn't pick an optimal boundary, because you'd always base it on whatever season you were predicting. You could adjust it until you get the best results, but ultimately when you're predicting it, you're not going to have that data. And the other issue was it wasn't very consistent. We tried, every single time we'd run it, it would move the centers of the clusters, so different teams would be incorporated in different clusters, and it would also change whether which team was tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. The naming convention just kept switching every time as well, which was very annoying and hard to work with. We tried doing a couple different methods then, because we decided, what if we just grouped them by what conference they play in? Maybe the conference has something to do with how the cluster that they're in. We tried that, but again, it's not very consistent. And how do you determine which clusters are the better, which conferences are the better conferences? And this ultimately led us into a big fancy word that I had on the very first, the title slide, and adaptive neuro-fuzzy inference system. Now, what this is a neural network. Neural networks are based on the synapses in the brain. It's a mathematical model for that. So it adjusts better, essentially. But what we were trying, the reason why we chose this one was because it's a lot like clustering. It has initial membership functions, which act as the clusters, and it tries to group each input into different membership clusters, and then it trains those so it adjusts the boundaries on its own to then mimic the outputs of the initial data that you put in. So like, for example, 2014. If I'm looking at predicting 2014, I would use 2012, 2013, maybe 2011 to try and predict the 2014 season. So I would use 2011, 2012, 2013 to then train my model and try and get the outputs to look as close to the actual outputs as I can. And of course we have to thank Colonel Livingston here because he's really the expert on this, and he helped us out a lot. So this gives a little bit better of an image. So what we did is we would take the line's value, which in this case was like a negative 12.2. And as you can see, there was two membership functions, the skewed left, the skewed right. And you can see that it takes part of each of these. So it's much more in this one, and same thing with here. We're using the Google Trend data and the line. And you can see that it takes partial membership, which is where it ended up being a lot better than the clustering, because it's more realistic, it's a little bit more flexible. Instead of saying like, you are tier 1, you are tier 2, it's like, you're mostly tier 1, and with this game though, you could, like, it kind of pushes you a little bit into the other categories. And then what happens is you see these blue bars, what each of those are, it tells you how much you should weight each of these categories. And then the very bottom gives a weighted average, which is our prediction. So in this example, the Google Trend data said that the away team was more popular, essentially. After we normalized it, it was a negative 4.8, which meant that we should give a little bit more of a bump to the road team. The line also said that the road team was favored, but because of the vast difference in Google Trend data there, our model said you should adjust it a little bit more for the road team. So you should predict at least a 13 points advantage to the road team. So, as I said, it emulates the known outputs. It's going to adjust the membership function parameters to best fit in the training. Then there's this concept of validation sets, which is I wanted to go a little bit into, not spend too much time on. But the validation sets are parts of the training data that I'm kind of using to say, hey, we should stop adjusting the membership function now. Because if you've ever worked with an interpolation where it goes through every single point, there can be a lot of noise through that. So we don't want it to fit exactly to that point. That would overtrain it and not necessarily be accurate when you're using it for future seasons. And then, as I said, we're going to test it on 2014 for best example. We did this pretending that we didn't know the outputs of these test seasons, so that our model never saw what actually happened. At the very end, we would compare it to what actually happened, but our model ahead of time never saw it. And we ended up predicting 2012, 2013, 2014. And here are the results for NCAA basketball. As you can see, did very well. What this percent correct is how many times, what percentage of the time did we predict the winner correctly? And we then compared it, this ranking here, we compared it against these 5 expert predictors. And they're people who get paid for this. Like, they're the ones who got paid, and I didn't get paid, but they're the ones who get paid to do this for a living. This is their job. So we thought, like, if we could beat these guys, that was kind of our goal this entire summer, at least, was we wanted to beat them, especially the line, because the line, like I said, is one of the best predictors out there. And this mean absolute error, right here, the reason why we were second is the line beat us on those 2. But what that is just on average, like, how far away are you from the actual outcome of the game. And this is the model. So it looks really cool, and you're like, oh man, what does that mean? But what this is our prediction over here, and this is the line's prediction, and then this is the Google Trend data. So for example, this -5, if you follow it up and say it predicted a 10, this -5 then says we should actually be shooting a little bit under the 10. So it adjusts the line very slightly. The Google Trend data does a very, very slight adjustment, but it seems to have this huge bump in the percent correct. I also have the results here for NCAA football. The major differences to note here, on the predictiontracker.com, which is what we were using to look at everyone else's predictions out there, that allowed us for all football, no basketball, but for football, we could look at 70 predictors at once and compare our results to all 70 to 75 depending on the season. So this ranking here almost means more, but it's still, they're all expert predictors regardless. And this big dip over here is because there's no data over there. We were trying to cut it out as much as possible, but as you can see, there was no times when the Google Trend data had a difference of 20 in favor of the home team, and the road team was favored by the line by 20. That never really happened. So that's why there's that huge dip in the data there. But otherwise, this is the same kind of model. And then I have the results for the professional as well. The one thing, again, we noticed was that for the NFL, it was a lot worse than the other 3 models. And some of the reasoning for that, we think, at least, is that there's not as many games. The NFL has way fewer games than NCAA basketball, which has thousands of games a season. So because of that, we're thinking there may not have been as much data just to build it on from there. The NBA, though, again, has a lot of games, and we still performed very well. So what is our model doing? That's another question to look at. Like I said, it's making small adjustments, but where are the adjustments coming from? So there are 9 cases, pretty much, that everything falls into. Like if the Google Trend data says, oh, you should favor the road team, and Vegas says, no, you should favor the home team. Like, as you can see, because it's such a small adjustment, you're still going to end up favoring the road team. You're still going to end up favoring the road team a little bit more whenever Google says that. So none of that is very interesting, I should say, except for this point right here, the middle square, which says that if the difference in Google Trend data is 0, so if these teams, according to popularity, are essentially the same, they're the same level of popularity, and the line says they're totally even, like we think that these teams are perfectly evenly matched. All that's really left is home court advantage. That's the only value that would be being input here. So the interesting thing is that most of the time you think the home team gets the advantage right away. Home team always has the advantage. What our model is saying, though, is that in football, the home team advantage seems to be overshot. It seems that people think too much for the home team advantage, home court advantage in basketball. Whereas for basketball, it says that they undervalue it. And this might be something due to, we're not 100% sure on this. This is where conjecture comes in a little bit. We have to try and come up with a theory that fits this. One of the ideas is like alumni coming back for football weekend. Football is always on Friday, Saturday nights. So it's drunk people coming back for a social event, maybe like, oh, I'm going to throw some money on the home team. Like, when in reality, it's like, oh, maybe you shouldn't be doing that. Maybe it should be towards the away. We think that basketball is, since it's every day of the week, it's not as often that you probably have a little bit more informed people betting on it at that point. So we think that might be the reason, but we're not 100% sure on that. So, further analysis. Where were we getting this bump in percentage correct? Because it was a pretty big bump. We were bumping up by about 4% at the most from the line, which is in NCAA basketball, that's hundreds of games. So we were kind of like, well, where are we getting this from? We found out that it was in these close games. For the most part. There were a couple other ones, but for the most part, it was in these close games where the line said 0, which meant that the line was saying the teams are totally even. And our Google Trend data actually seemed to adjust it to favor whichever one actually ended up winning. So, for example, NCAA basketball 2014, there were 42 games where the line said the teams were totally even. Our model predicted about 62% of them correct, whereas the other 4 predictors that I had mentioned earlier, the expert predictors that we've been comparing against, only had a 40 to 53% correct total, which was incredible. A 10% bump is huge. And then this is our next logical step, because you saw our results, we did really well with this predicting. We thought, well, what's the next step after predicting? Like, what can we do after we've predicted the game? It's like, well, we could rank the teams. So, our goal here was to try and get some sort of system that made sense using R values. So this B is going to be it's a simple model. It's just back to matrix algebra. AX equals B. So this R vector is a column vector where it's going to be the length of the number of teams that you have. So team 1, team 2, team 3, all the way down. This A matrix is the most interesting part because it has the same number of rows as every game. So 1 row for every single game, and then 1 column for every single team. And then you're going to put a 1 with whichever team won, and a -1 if the team lost. So in every single row, you're only going to have 2 values, a 1 and a -1, that correspond to whichever team's position in that game. Is that kind of making sense? And then you're just going to solve for the R. And this B, which is usually used as the outcome of the game, we input our predictions for the game. And we wanted to see, like, how does our ranking compare? And this is what we got. So this is the ESPN power rating, which is, it is found by ESPN's Power Panel, as they called it, which is a group of more than 80 writers, editors, and TV personalities. They just pick, they decide, they talk to each other, they have this big thing, they have votes, and they vote on who is the best team in that season. So, 2014 NFL season, that's who they picked. And then if you look, this is what our model said should be the best. The top 10. I only listed the top 10 because all 32 teams would have been a lot harder to read. But as you can see, there's a lot of similarities. So Seattle, New England, Green Bay Packers, Denver Broncos, we all have the same ones there, which I thought was interesting. I think that's kind of a good show of how well our model is doing. It kind of looks like it's predicting it correctly, or it looks like it's giving a pretty decent rating system. This one's a little weird, the Kansas City Chiefs right here. But that being said, the top, at least the majority of, a lot of these appear over here as well, which is a good indication that it was doing well. So what's next? Where can we go with this? Now that we have all these great results. Obviously, improve it even more. How can we make it better? Let's keep going. Dr. Jeff Heath from Center College presented at the joint mathematics meeting with us, and he had a very interesting way of rating teams that we think could be very helpful and predictive in our model. So we were doing some preliminary work with that already, with using his values for ranking the teams and inputting them as another input value. Another step is some more experimentation with the Amphis model, because I used the basic default values, and we could potentially optimize those. We're trying to do some more work with those. Another idea we had was changing some of the variables involved. Right now we're relying purely on the line, which could be limiting. They only predict so many sports, and they only have, we can only get their, we have to wait for them to give their prediction for us to give our prediction. So maybe there's something we can do, like make our own model that's maybe not as good as the line, but maybe do one of those failed methods and try and adjust that one. But again, that's just sort of some conjecture, some thought on that one. And then, yeah, that is my presentation. Questions?
What's the Google trend data based on?
It's number of Google searches.
Just, it is popularity.
It's totally popularity because it's based on how many times that team is searched. And a lot of people actually ask me about that one. I've had a lot of questions on, well, what if a team is really popular but not as good?
The Cowboys.
Exactly. So some of the idea with that, we found that didn't actually matter too much, because if we looked during a season when there was a huge scandal or something like that, that didn't actually create a large bump in the overall popularity. It seemed to, it's all the peaks in that data. Here, I can go back to it. All the peaks corresponded